The name Lucky Luciano still carries a chill, the kind that travels through time, whispered in dimly lit bars and backroom conversations, long after the man himself has turned to dust. To say his name is to invoke something larger than a man. A myth, a shadow, a symbol of an era when the line between power and fear blurred into a single dangerous thing. His story isn't just about organized crime. It's about America itself, ambition and corruption rising side by side, the immigrant dream corrupted into something darker, sharper, and infinitely more enduring. Imagine this, a smoky club in mid-century New York. The music hums, the laughter is forced, and in a back booth, a group of older men drink in silence. One of them gestures toward a framed photograph on the wall, a thin man with slicked back hair and a cold, assessing gaze. That, he mutters, was Lucky Luciano. The table falls quiet. Even decades later, the name commands a pause. Not because of what he did, but because of what he represented. Luciano was not born into power. He built it, piece by piece, deal by deal, betrayal by betrayal, until he became the architect of an invisible empire. He didn't invent organized crime, but he gave it order, logic, and discipline. Before him, the mafia was chaos, a collection of small-time hoods, bound by blood feuds and ancient grudges. After him, it was a corporation. The commission he built outlived him. It still shapes the underworld today, its structure mirrored in criminal organizations from New York to Naples, Hong Kong to Moscow. But why does the name still matter? Why does a man born in 1897 still command both fear and respect in 2025? Because Luciano was more than a gangster. He was a symbol of transformation. He saw power differently. To him, fear was not just a weapon, it was currency. Respect was not given, it was extracted. Every glance, every handshake, every whispered threat had a purpose. And behind it all was an unshakable belief that power was not about violence but control. Yet his story is also one of contradictions. A man capable of brutality, yet admired for his intellect. A criminal who cooperated with the U.S. Navy during World War II. A leader who demanded loyalty while living in exile. To understand Luciano is to understand a paradox. A man who mastered both order and chaos, who could inspire loyalty as easily as terror. His name echoes not because of what he stole, but because of what he built. This documentary isn't about glorifying crime. It's about tracing the anatomy of power, how it's gained, how it's used, and how it inevitably consumes those who wield it. Luciano's life reads like a script written by fate and greed. The immigrant child clawing his way out of poverty, the cunning strategist who redefined an empire, the prisoner who still pulled the strings from behind bars, and the exile who died looking over his shoulder. The world that created him was a breeding ground for ambition. Early 20th century New York was a city of opportunity and oppression, where Italian immigrants crowded into tenements, working endless hours for pennies while watching corrupt politicians and businessmen grow rich. Luciano saw the hypocrisy early. If the law served only the powerful, he decided, then he would become powerful, by any means necessary. And so began his transformation from Salvatore Lucania, a kid from Sicily, into Charles Lucky Luciano, the man who would make the mafia modern. But beneath the legend lies the man, restless, ambitious, calculating. He didn't just want money, he wanted control. He understood psychology in a way few men of his time did. He knew when to charm and when to terrify. He knew how to build loyalty and when to destroy it. He spoke of business, not crime. He saw himself not as a thug, but as a CEO of the underworld, and in his own way he was right. His empire was vast, profitable, and ruthlessly efficient. Still, power built on fear is never stable. Every decision Luciano made came with a price. Every ally could become an enemy. Every favor carried a debt. As we journey through his story, we'll see not just how he rose, but how he fell, and how, in his downfall, he became immortal. Because men like Luciano don't vanish when they die. They linger, in stories, in systems, in the dark corners of cities that still run on the principles he created. This story is not just history. It's a mirror, reflecting the timeless allure of control, the seduction of authority, and the thin, dangerous line between respect and fear. Luciano's legacy forces us to ask an unsettling question. What kind of world allows a man like him to rise? And perhaps more chillingly, what kind of world still admires him for it? So we begin here, with the ghost of power. A man whose name refuses to fade. A man who redefined crime, reshaped loyalty, and reimagined fear. Lucky Luciano, the criminal who became a king and the king who became a myth. His story is not just about the underworld, it's about us. The systems we build, the power we chase, and the shadows we pretend not to see. To understand Lucky Luciano, you must first understand the city that made him, New York in the early 1900s. It wasn't the glittering metropolis of Broadway lights and Wall Street wealth that the world imagines today. It was a battlefield. A city of noise, hunger, and survival. The Lower East Side was overflowing with newly arrived immigrants, Italians, Jews, Irish, Poles, all crammed into airless tenements that stacked families like sardines. The smell of coal smoke mixed with sweat and desperation. Every morning, children flooded the streets to sell newspapers, shine shoes, or simply beg for coins. In these narrow, broken streets, the promise of the American dream had already soured. For most, it was a cruel illusion. The city that promised opportunity offered only hard labor and humiliation. Italian families, fleeing poverty in Sicily and Naples, found themselves in a different kind of prison. Trapped in poverty, mocked for their accents, treated as second-class citizens. It was in this chaos that Salvatore Lucania, the boy who would become Lucky Luciano, learned his first lessons about the world, that no one would hand him power and that the system was not built for men like him to win. Luciano's childhood was not one of innocence. He was born in 1897 in Lercora, Sicily, a land where poverty and violence were inherited traits. When his family immigrated to America in 1906, young Salvatore stepped off the ship not into freedom, but into another kind of struggle. His father, Antonio, worked long hours as a laborer hauling concrete and stone. His mother took in laundry. Their world was simple: work hard, stay honest, and maybe, just maybe, you'll survive. But to a young boy with sharp eyes and a sharper instinct, it was obvious that honest men stayed poor. The real money was made elsewhere, in the shadows. New York at the time was ruled by corruption. Politicians, police, and gangsters danced in the same smoky rooms, exchanging bribes like handshakes. The city's underbelly was alive with rackets, gambling, prostitution, extortion, all run by local gangs who controlled neighborhoods like feudal lords. In Little Italy, these gangs weren't just criminals. They were protectors, employers, and community leaders. For poor immigrants who didn't trust the law, men like them were necessary evils. They offered security, at a price. Salvatore saw this power early. By the time he was 10, he was running errands for gangsters, carrying messages and packages he didn't dare open. He learned the language of the streets, how to read a man's eyes, how to know when to run, how to keep your mouth shut. Silence, he realized, was more valuable than honesty. When he started skipping school and gambling with the older boys on Hester Street, it wasn't rebellion, it was training. The city was teaching him its rules. At 14, Luciano joined a gang. Not the most powerful one, not yet, but enough to learn the basics of power. He was street smart, bold, and unafraid to use his fists. But unlike the other boys, Luciano thought in terms of structure. He wasn't content with chaos. He watched how the bigger players operated, how bribes flowed upward, how loyalty was bought, how the cops looked the other way for the right price. Even as a teenager, he was already thinking like a businessman. The police knew his name before he turned 18. Arrested for petty theft, illegal gambling, and carrying a concealed weapon, Luciano was no stranger to a holding cell. But every time he got out, he came back smarter. He wasn't just learning crime, he was learning organization. He understood that the city's true power didn't belong to the honest or the righteous. It belonged to those who could control chaos without being destroyed by it. But the streets also hardened him. He saw hunger, humiliation, and death up close. He saw kids his age stabbed for a few coins, women beaten by drunks, and men disappear for crossing the wrong boss. In this environment, morality was a luxury. The choice was simple: dominate or be dominated. The thin line between survival and failure was drawn in blood. Meanwhile, America itself was transforming. The 1910s and 1920s were an age of contradictions. Progress and corruption intertwined. The Industrial Revolution had filled cities with factories and opportunity, but also with resentment and inequality. For immigrants like Luciano, the so-called land of the free felt rigged. The political machines that ran the city, like Tammany Hall, relied on the very same criminal networks they publicly condemned. Power and crime had become inseparable. It's easy to romanticize this period, the streetlights, the jazz, the speakeasies, but beneath the charm lay a brutal truth: the American dream was not built for everyone. Men like Luciano weren't born villains. They were shaped by a world that rewarded cunning over conscience. Every corrupt cop, every politician taking a bribe, every businessman who paid off gangsters for protection, they all helped build the ecosystem that allowed a boy from the slums to one day rule the city. In this crucible of poverty and corruption, Luciano developed two defining traits: pragmatism and ambition. He didn't dream of escaping the streets, he dreamed of owning them. He began to think bigger than the petty gangs of Mulberry Street. He imagined an underworld run not by blood feuds and superstition, but by logic, a world where criminals could work together, share profits, avoid unnecessary wars. It was an idea far ahead of its time. By the age of 20, Luciano had already made a name for himself among the city's young hustlers. He wasn't the strongest or the most violent, but he was the smartest. He understood money. He understood people. He understood that in New York, the greatest power came not from fear alone, but from organization, from making chaos obey. The streets that broke so many others had taught him their most important lesson. The system could not be trusted, but it could be mastered. In a city built on lies, Luciano had found his truth. Control was everything. From these tenements and alleys, from this city of smoke and deceit, the legend of Lucky Luciano began to take shape. He wasn't just another gangster rising from the gutter. He was something different, the product of a broken world and the man who would one day learn how to bend it to his will. By the time Salvatore Lucania reached his late teens, the streets had already reshaped him. The innocent boy who once followed his father to work was gone, replaced by a sharp-eyed hustler who understood how the city really worked. Power didn't come from honesty, it came from opportunity, and from the courage to take it before someone else did. The world around him was a chessboard, and even then he was learning how to play several moves ahead. Luciano's rise began in the melting pot of immigrant gangs that controlled New York's Lower East Side. By day he ran errands, gambled, and learned how to handle himself in a fight. By night he sat in smoky backrooms, listening to older gangsters talk about territory, protection rackets, and police payoffs. He was an observer, quiet but calculating. While most boys his age were chasing girls or running small scams, Luciano was studying power, who had it, how they kept it, and how easily it could be taken away. Around 1914 his name began to spread. He was bold, reliable, and unflinchingly loyal to those he respected, until it no longer served him. It was during these years that he met two other young men who would change his life forever: Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Unlike most of the gangsters on the street, Lansky wasn't Italian. He was Jewish, small, quiet, and dangerously intelligent. The two first crossed paths during a street brawl between Jewish and Italian kids, and instead of fighting they talked. Luciano saw something rare in Lansky: discipline, intellect, and a business sense sharper than any blade. They realized they were cut from the same cloth. Both immigrants, both ambitious, both unwilling to stay poor. Together they formed an unspoken alliance. One built not on ethnicity or tradition but on efficiency and money. This friendship was revolutionary. In an era when most gangs stayed loyal to their own bloodlines, Luciano and Lansky saw a different future. They believed that organized crime could be unified, that profits could replace prejudice. Bugsy Siegel, volatile but fearless, joined them soon after. Between Luciano's charisma, Lansky's brains, and Siegel's muscle, they became a force that would one day reshape the underworld. During the Prohibition era, which began in 1920, their ambitions found their perfect fuel. When the U.S. government banned alcohol, it created a billion-dollar black market overnight. To most it was chaos, to Luciano it was a business opportunity. He saw how the demand for liquor could turn street gangs into industrial-scale operations. He began working under established Italian bosses like Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria, running bootlegging routes, coordinating shipments, and forging connections with Irish and Jewish mobsters. But Luciano's real strength wasn't just in making money, it was in seeing patterns others missed. He noticed how inefficient the mafia's old ways were. The mustache Petes, as they were called, the old Sicilian dons who clung to feudal traditions, refused to trust anyone who wasn't born in Sicily. They demanded obedience and respect but offered no innovation. Luciano found their methods outdated, their secrecy suffocating. While they spoke of honor, he spoke of profit. He wasn't bound by old-world loyalties. His loyalty was to power itself. During these years, Luciano earned his nickname, Lucky. There are many stories about how he got it. Some say it came after he survived a brutal beating and stabbing in 1929, left for dead by rival kidnappers. Others claim it was his uncanny ability to escape police raids or his skill at surviving impossible situations. But to those who knew him, the nickname wasn't just about survival. It was about control. Luciano made his own luck. He read situations like a gambler who already knew the cards. The near-fatal beating in 1929 marked a turning point. His attackers kidnapped him, robbed him, and left him bleeding in Staten Island. But Luciano refused to give his enemies the satisfaction of weakness. When he appeared in public weeks later, bruised but alive, his reputation skyrocketed. The message was clear. Lucky Luciano could not be killed, at least not easily. In the world of crime, that kind of reputation was worth more than gold. As his influence grew, so did his ambitions. He began to imagine an empire beyond the chaos of gang wars. With Lansky's help, he envisioned an organization that operated like a multinational corporation, a board of directors overseeing criminal enterprises, divided by region, working together instead of killing each other. It was an idea no one had dared attempt before. The old dons would have seen it as heresy, but to Luciano it was evolution. Through the 1920s he became Missouri's trusted lieutenant, managing vast bootlegging networks and brokering deals with other crime families. Yet even as he rose under Missouri, Luciano's mind was elsewhere. He saw that the future of the mafia depended on modernization, alliances that cut across ethnic lines, rules that prioritized money over pride, and a structure that could survive beyond one man's leadership. He was preparing to build something immortal. But success came at a cost. The life he chose demanded sacrifice, friendships strained by betrayal, loyalties tested by greed. Luciano understood that power was not about who you trusted, but about who you could afford to lose. Each decision hardened him further, stripping away hesitation, compassion, and doubt. The boy from the Lower East Side was gone. In his place stood a man who viewed the world through a single lens: control the system or be crushed by it. By the end of the decade, Lucky Luciano was no longer just another gangster. He was a strategist, a visionary, and a silent revolutionary within the underworld. He didn't shout or posture like the old dons. He didn't need to. His presence alone demanded respect. Every crime boss in New York knew his name. Some feared him. Others wanted to be him. All understood that the game was changing, and that the man leading that change was Lucky Luciano. Before Lucky Luciano, the mafia in America was a mess, a violent, disorganized sprawl of feuding clans, each guarding their own little territory like medieval barons. It wasn't an empire. It wasn't even a system. It was chaos dressed in loyalty, ruled by blood feuds, superstition, and a suffocating devotion to the past. The men who controlled it, the so-called Mustache Petes, were relics of Sicily, men who brought their old world codes to a new world that no longer obeyed them. To understand Luciano's revolution, you must first understand what came before him: a world trapped between tradition and survival. In the early 1900s, the Italian-American criminal underworld was not unified. It was fractured into regional families, each led by bosses who demanded absolute loyalty and tolerated no compromise. These bosses came from small Sicilian villages where vendettas lasted generations and trust was rarer than gold. Their idea of power was rooted in fear, in the ability to make a man disappear for looking the wrong way or speaking out of turn. Respect was earned through violence, not vision. And the only rule that mattered was omerta, the sacred vow of silence. The omerta wasn't just a code of silence, it was a worldview. To the old dons, it meant that the law of the land, the American justice system, didn't exist for them. Disputes were settled with blood, not words. This ancient Sicilian philosophy made sense in the rural hills of Palermo, where distrust of government was a matter of survival. But in New York City, it became a cage. The old bosses couldn't adapt to a place where politics, business, and crime were all entangled. They refused to see that America wasn't Sicily, that power here came not from heritage but from control over systems. In the 1910s and 1920s, as waves of immigrants flooded New York, the Italian gangs competed not only with each other but also with the Irish and Jewish mobs. The Irish controlled the police and the docks. The Jews had financial brains and access to black market goods. The Italians, meanwhile, fought among themselves, each family claiming a few blocks of Little Italy as their kingdom. It was territorial warfare on a microscopic scale. Gunfights erupted over street corners. Businesses were extorted by multiple gangs at once. There was no unity, no structure, no strategy, just violence without direction. And yet, beneath this chaos lay potential. The mafia had deep roots in the immigrant community. They offered protection to Italian shopkeepers, jobs to the unemployed, and a sense of belonging to those alienated by American society. To the working poor, they were both oppressors and saviors. They were the ones who could get a loan when banks wouldn't, the ones who could find you a job, or make your enemy disappear. In a world that ignored the powerless, the mafia gave them something to believe in. But even that sense of order was fragile, dependent on the whims of men who could not see beyond their own pride. The most powerful of these old dons in the 1920s was Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria. He embodied everything about the old mafia: ruthless, proud, and stubbornly traditional. He demanded absolute obedience and expected his men to bow to him like feudal subjects. Under his rule, every gangster paid tribute. But Masuria had enemies, chief among them, another old-school Sicilian named Salvatore Maranzano. Both men dreamed of total control over New York's underworld, and both despised the idea of sharing power. Their rivalry would eventually explode into open war, the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict that would shape the destiny of the mafia for generations. But before that war erupted, there were men like Luciano watching from the sidelines, learning. He worked for Masuria, yes, but he saw the flaws. The endless feuds, the wasted money, the needless killings. He saw how the old dons treated ambition as betrayal, how their obsession with Sicilian bloodlines blinded them to opportunity. They refused to trust non-Italians, refused to innovate, refused to let go of control. To Luciano they were dinosaurs. The world was changing. Prohibition was making criminals rich overnight, but these old bosses still acted like peasants fighting over farmland. The irony was that, even as the mafia grew richer from bootlegging, it was tearing itself apart from within. Rivalries between families were constant. Betrayals were common. The more money they made, the more they fought. The mustache Petes could not see that by clinging to the old ways, they were dooming themselves. Their empire had no rules, no organization, and no future. Luciano studied all of this with cold detachment. He admired their power, but he despised their arrogance. He knew that tradition could be useful, but only if it served the goal of progress. What he envisioned was something entirely new, a criminal organization that operated like a corporation, not a tribe. A network bound not by blood but by business. He imagined a council where every major family had representation, where disputes were settled by consensus rather than bullets. It was a radical idea, and it would require tearing down everything the old mafia stood for. At that time, such an idea would have been heresy. The mustache Petes believed in hierarchy, in keeping power within their bloodlines, in killing anyone who questioned their authority. To them, Luciano was a dangerous young upstart, too modern, too ambitious, too American. They saw his alliances with Jewish and Irish gangsters as betrayal. They couldn't understand that Luciano wasn't turning his back on the mafia. He was reinventing it for a new world. As the 1920s drew to a close, the tension between old and new, between Sicily and America, reached its breaking point. The stage was set for revolution, one that would be written not in politics or ideology but in blood. The old bosses had built their world on fear and tradition. Luciano would burn that world down, and from its ashes build something far more dangerous: order. By the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano was no longer just a rising figure, he was a man with a vision. The old mafia was crumbling under its own arrogance, and he saw what no one else dared to imagine: that crime, if organized and managed like a legitimate business, could become unstoppable. Luciano's genius was not in inventing the mafia, it was in reinventing it. He was about to turn an unruly network of violent men into a streamlined empire, one that operated with boardroom logic instead of vendetta rage. The first step in that transformation was survival. The Castellamarese War had erupted, a bloody civil war between Joe, the boss Masuria, and Salvatore Maranzano, two men who represented the dying breath of the old mafia order. For Luciano, both were obstacles. Masuria was his boss, yes, but he was unpredictable, greedy, and blind to the future. Maranzano, his rival, was no better, obsessed with titles, traditions, and Sicilian hierarchy. Luciano saw them for what they were: relics fighting over a crumbling throne. But Luciano didn't pick sides based on loyalty, he picked based on opportunity. He realized that for the mafia to survive, for him to survive, both Masuria and Maranzano had to go. He began playing a dangerous game, feeding each side information, pretending loyalty to both while quietly assembling his own power base. Around him stood the young generation: Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, men who, like him, saw crime as an enterprise, not a feud. Together, they represented a new order waiting to be born. Luciano's brilliance lay in his understanding of structure. He believed every operation, whether legal or illegal, needed three things: organization, discipline, and profit sharing. He envisioned a nationwide criminal syndicate where each family controlled its territory but cooperated under one governing body, what he would later call the Commission. Instead of constant wars, there would be meetings. Instead of blind loyalty, there would be contracts. And above all, disputes would no longer be settled with bullets but with votes. It was a revolutionary idea for a world built on paranoia and blood. But vision without action meant nothing. Luciano was a realist, and he knew that to build something new, the old had to die. He arranged for Joe Masuria's assassination in 1931, luring him to a Coney Island restaurant under the guise of a peace meeting. While Luciano excused himself to the restroom, gunmen burst in and riddled Masuria with bullets. The message was clear: the age of the old dons was over. When the smoke cleared, Maranzano stepped in as the self-proclaimed boss of bosses, declaring himself the supreme ruler of the American mafia. It was an echo of the same arrogance Luciano had just erased. Maranzano's attempt to impose feudal order on a new generation was his fatal mistake. Luciano, understanding that absolute power could never coexist with his vision, struck again. Months later, Maranzano was murdered in his office by men posing as government agents. A clean, calculated hit that marked the true beginning of the modern mafia. With both of the old bosses gone, Luciano unveiled his grand design. He established the Commission, a governing council composed of the most powerful families in the country, the 5 families of New York, along with Chicago's Al Capone organization and others from across the U.S. There would be no single boss of bosses. Instead, the Commission would operate like a corporate board, ensuring peace, regulating profits, and maintaining order. It was a system based not on fear but on balance, a criminal democracy. For the first time, organized crime had organization in the truest sense. Each family was independent but interconnected, bound by the shared understanding that business came first. Luciano's philosophy was simple: there's enough for everybody. Violence would only draw attention, cooperation would bring wealth. He replaced the old mafia's blood feuds with efficiency and logic. The mafia had evolved, and at its center stood a man who combined the mind of a strategist with the instincts of a predator. Lucky Luciano had done the impossible. He had turned a culture of chaos into a functioning empire. He had replaced the knife with the handshake, the vendetta with the meeting, and the past with the future. Under his leadership, the mafia would reach levels of power no one had thought possible. But with every empire comes its shadow. The more perfect the system, the more dangerous the man who controls it. Luciano's vision had created order, but in doing so, it had also created the machinery of absolute power. And in that machine, the seeds of his own downfall were already being planted. The year was 1930, and New York's underworld was drowning in blood. The Castellammarese War had turned the streets into a battlefield, a brutal civil conflict between 2 titans of the old mafia world, Joe, the boss Masuria, and Salvatore Maranzano. What began as a power struggle soon became a war for the soul of organized crime itself. On one side stood Masuria, stubborn, greedy, and deeply rooted in the traditions of Sicily. On the other stood Maranzano, intelligent but just as ruthless, a man who envisioned himself as the Caesar of a criminal empire. And caught between them was Lucky Luciano, the quiet architect who would use their war to build his future. For nearly 2 years the war consumed the city. Bombings, ambushes, and assassinations became routine. Innocent bystanders were caught in the crossfire. Every day brought another corpse to Mulberry Street, another headline screaming of gangland murders. To the outside world it was chaos. But to Luciano it was opportunity. He watched from the shadows, studying both men, waiting for the right moment to strike. Masuria had long been his boss, but Luciano saw the truth: Masuria's greed was choking progress. He demanded high cuts from his men, distrusted alliances with non-Italians, and clung to ancient codes that made business impossible. Maranzano, on the other hand, offered a vision of structure and order, but beneath it all he was just another tyrant in waiting. Luciano understood that neither man could rule the new world he wanted to build. Both were obstacles. And in the underworld, obstacles were meant to be removed. The war reached its peak in early 1931. Bodies piled up on both sides, and profits from prohibition were dwindling as gangs focused more on revenge than business. Luciano began to position himself as the mediator, the young voice of reason in a world of aging warriors. He met quietly with his allies, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese, and laid out a daring plan. The war would end, but only after both kings were dead. The old world would be erased, and from its ashes, they would create a new one. The first move was against Masuria. Luciano arranged a peace meeting at a small restaurant in Coney Island in April 1931. The setting was intimate: white tablecloths, playing cards, and a bottle of Chianti. Luciano played his part perfectly, charming and deferential. Then, excusing himself to the restroom, he left the table. Moments later, his gunmen stormed in, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis and Vito Genovese, and filled the air with bullets. When Luciano returned, Masuria was slumped over the table, his blood mixing with the spilled wine. The era of Joe the Boss was over. For a brief moment, it seemed Maranzano had won. With Masuria dead, he declared himself boss of bosses, the supreme ruler of the mafia. He reorganized the families, creating the 5 families of New York and assigning territories to each. On the surface this seemed progressive, a move toward structure. But in truth, Maranzano's rule was no different from Masuria's. He demanded tribute, disrespected younger leaders, and plotted to eliminate anyone who threatened his throne, including Luciano himself. Luciano sensed the danger almost immediately. Maranzano's arrogance blinded him. He underestimated the younger generation. When Luciano learned that Maranzano planned to have him killed, he acted first. On September 10, 1931, Luciano sent a team of assassins, disguised as government agents, to Maranzano's office in the New York Central Building. The hit was swift and clean. They stabbed and shot Maranzano before he could reach for his gun. By the time his body hit the floor, the old mafia had died with him. The Castellamarese War ended not with a treaty, but with transformation. Luciano emerged not as a warlord but as a reformer, a man who had replaced chaos with order, vengeance with profit. He dismantled the outdated hierarchy of the old Sicilian dons and replaced it with a structure that would last for decades: the Commission. For the first time in American history, organized crime had a system, a council that governed disputes, managed territories and ensured cooperation between families. In less than 2 years, Luciano had achieved what no one else could. He had survived the bloodiest mafia war in history, eliminated his rivals, and rebuilt the underworld in his image. The newspapers called it peace, his peers called it genius. But Luciano knew the truth: it was not peace he had built, but control. Every handshake, every deal, every drop of blood spilled during the war had led to this moment. He had become the invisible emperor, the man who ruled not by fear alone but by design. The mafia had been reborn, and at its center stood Lucky Luciano, calm, composed, and untouchable. The war had taken everything from others, but for him, it had given birth to destiny. In the months following the Castellamarese War, the air in New York seemed to change. The streets that had once run red with blood now hummed with quiet business. The war was over, but Lucky Luciano knew peace was a fragile illusion. One wrong move and the city would descend back into chaos. He had not risked everything just to rule over the ruins of the old mafia. He wanted something enduring, something intelligent, something modern. From that vision came his greatest creation, the Commission. Luciano's goal was simple but revolutionary: to end the feudal, ego-driven rule of the boss of bosses, and replace it with a system that mirrored corporate governance. The Commission would function like a criminal board of directors, ensuring stability, mediating disputes, and dividing profits fairly. Each major mafia family would have representation: equality instead of tyranny, cooperation instead of war. It was democracy by design, though drenched in the logic of power and blood. He invited the most influential figures in organized crime to join. The 5 New York families, Luciano's own, along with the families of Joe Prophesai, Vincent Mangano, Tommy Gagliano, and Joseph Bonanno, formed the core. But Luciano didn't stop there. He expanded the circle to include Al Capone's Chicago outfit, Buffalo's Stefano Megadino, and other powerful mob bosses from across the country. It was the first national syndicate in American history, uniting crime from coast to coast under one unseen flag. Meetings were held in secrecy: smoke-filled hotel rooms, dim backrooms of restaurants, guarded warehouses by the docks. There the new order took shape. The Commission would decide on territory, arbitration, and discipline. No one man could declare war without the approval of the others. Murders required justification. Disputes were handled through negotiation, not bullets. It was a cold, bureaucratic approach to murder, and it worked. For Luciano, it was about more than just peace, it was about efficiency. The mafia had always been emotional, tangled in pride, revenge, and Sicilian codes that wasted time and blood. Luciano replaced those emotions with business logic. "There's no money in fighting," he famously said. "There's money in business." And business was booming. Prohibition was still in full swing, and illegal liquor flowed through every speakeasy in America. Luciano and his allies didn't compete for it, they controlled it. With Meyer Lansky's financial genius, they created distribution networks that mirrored legitimate corporations, using fleets of trucks, warehouses, and secret partnerships with corrupt politicians and police. Luciano's reach extended from Manhattan to Havana, from Chicago to Los Angeles. But his genius wasn't just structural, it was psychological. He understood men. He knew that power meant giving others a sense of power. While he ruled with quiet authority, he made his peers believe they were equals. The commission members respected him not out of fear, but out of admiration and necessity. Luciano had become the bridge between old-world tradition and modern enterprise. Yet, beneath the surface of this newfound order, danger still simmered. Old loyalties and rivalries never truly died. Vito Genovese, Luciano's ambitious underboss, resented his leadership and coveted his throne. Joe Bonanno quietly dreamed of expanding his own influence beyond the Bronx. Even the Chicago outfit, powerful but unpredictable, could be a threat if crossed. Luciano's empire was stable, but like all empires, it rested on fragile alliances. Still, for now he was untouchable. With the commission in place, Luciano had achieved something no crime boss ever had: a system where order ruled chaos. He could now focus on expansion, not just in territory but in industry. Gambling, prostitution, narcotics, labor unions, and legitimate fronts all fell under the mafia's growing influence. The lines between criminal and businessman began to blur. Luciano had turned the mafia into a shadow corporation, unseen yet everywhere. In the public eye he was invisible. To the government he was a ghost. But in the underworld he was the architect of the new age, the man who could call a meeting in New York and have echoes heard in Chicago, Havana, and beyond. He didn't need a crown because his power was systemic, embedded in the very structure he created. The commission was more than an organization, it was Luciano's masterpiece, the invisible machinery of control that would outlive him. But power, even the kind built on logic and structure, breeds resentment. Every empire creates its own enemies, and every visionary eventually becomes a target. For now, though, Luciano stood at the peak of his reign. The war was over. The business was booming. The mafia was unified. And for the first time in its bloody history, it had a leader who didn't rule through chaos, but through order. By the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano had done what no one else had even dreamed of. He turned chaos into structure, war into profit, and men of violence into businessmen. With the commission now the beating heart of organized crime, Luciano's focus shifted from survival to expansion. The age of street gangs and reckless shootouts was over. What lay ahead was something bigger, cleaner, and infinitely more profitable. Luciano would make the mafia operate not as a gang, but as a corporation. The foundation of his empire was built on one truth: prohibition had changed everything. Alcohol had become America's forbidden gold mine, and the men who controlled it controlled the country's nightlife, its unions, even its politicians. Luciano understood that prohibition wouldn't last forever, so he prepared for what came next. The law changes, he once said, but people don't. There will always be something they want that they shouldn't have. It was this cold understanding of human desire that guided every decision he made. Under his leadership, the mafia diversified. Gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering, and prostitution, each became a cog in Luciano's machine. He didn't just profit from vice, he professionalized it. Gambling, for instance, was no longer run out of smoky backrooms or alley dice games. Luciano brought it into luxury hotels and private clubs. He saw gambling not as a sin but as a service, a business of dreams, losses, and illusions. His closest ally, Meyer Lansky, became the financial brain behind this expansion. While Luciano managed power and politics, Lansky handled the numbers, creating systems for laundering money through legitimate businesses. Hotels, nightclubs, laundromats, even construction firms became fronts for illicit income. Together they made crime look clean, almost respectable. But the real revolution lay in how Luciano handled labor. Through his associate Frank Costello, he infiltrated the unions, the dockworkers, the truckers, the garment industry, turning them into instruments of leverage. If a company wanted peace, it paid. If it didn't, strikes and accidents would follow. The mafia became the invisible hand that controlled New York's working class, and through them, its economy. What set Luciano apart was his detachment. To him, crime wasn't about bloodlust or ego, it was about systems. He treated his organization like a multinational company long before such companies existed. There were rules, territories, hierarchies, and punishments for inefficiency. He held meetings, assigned responsibilities, and demanded reports. In a world where everyone thought with their fists, he thought with strategy. Yet Luciano's brilliance also lay in his diplomacy. He believed in cooperation even with non-Italians, a radical move at the time. His friendship with Jewish mobsters like Lansky and Bugsy Siegel broke racial and ethnic boundaries that old mafia dons would have never crossed. Luciano didn't care about bloodlines, he cared about profit. This melting pot of criminals became known as the National Crime Syndicate, a multi-ethnic network that controlled everything from Havana's casinos to the New Jersey docks. But while Luciano was building an empire of money, another kind of empire was watching: the government. Law enforcement agencies, especially under New York District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey, began to realize that the mafia was no longer just a street problem, it was an institution. Raids on brothels, gambling dens and labor offices revealed a spiderweb of connections leading back to one man, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Despite his clean public image, whispers of his control began to circulate. His name was never on any document, but his influence was everywhere, from the prostitutes on 52nd Street to the union bosses on the docks. Luciano had become a ghost in his own kingdom, ruling through intermediaries, his hands never directly dirty. Still, the more successful he became, the more dangerous the game grew. Power attracts attention, and attention attracts enemies. The old guard still despised him for breaking Sicilian traditions. Rival bosses envied his wealth and influence. And now the press and the courts were closing in. The walls were tightening, not from the streets this time but from the suits in the courthouse. But in these years Luciano was unstoppable. He embodied the perfect balance between brutality and brilliance, ruthlessness and refinement. He hosted politicians and movie stars at the same tables where he discussed murder contracts. He was both businessman and outlaw, civilized and savage. The mafia had evolved under his leadership from a loose network of criminals into a national organization, one with rules, profits and purpose. Luciano's empire wasn't built on bullets, it was built on understanding human weakness, the hunger for pleasure, power and money. He gave people what they wanted and in return he took what he needed. In every way that mattered, Lucky Luciano had succeeded. He had turned crime into a brand, efficient, profitable and nearly invisible. But with every empire there comes a reckoning. And for Luciano that reckoning was already on its way, carried not by his enemies in the streets, but by the law he thought he had outsmarted. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire seemed indestructible. The commission ran smoothly, money flowed like wine, and violence was now a calculated tool instead of daily chaos. But beneath the facade of order, fault lines were beginning to form. Every empire breeds jealousy, every system creates cracks, and Luciano's syndicate was no exception. Behind the smiling faces and cigar smoke, a silent war was being waged, a war of ambition, betrayal and law. The first threat didn't come from the outside, it came from within. Vito Genovese, Luciano's trusted underboss, had always been loyal, or so it seemed. Genovese admired Luciano but resented his modernity, his alliances with Jews, and his willingness to bend old Sicilian rules. He believed the mafia had lost its soul under Luciano's leadership. What Genovese wanted wasn't just power, he wanted purity, a return to the old world where blood and fear ruled. To him, Luciano's commission was too democratic, too American. The tension between the two men was silent but deadly. Luciano was pragmatic. He knew Genovese's ambition could be both an asset and a threat. He tolerated him for his effectiveness but kept him close enough to watch. Still, Luciano wasn't blind to the whispers. Genovese's ego grew and with it, his impatience. He began building quiet alliances with other traditionalists, waiting for the day he could take control. While internal tensions simmered, the external world was shifting fast. The Great Depression had left America desperate, and law enforcement, once easily bribed or distracted, was now under public pressure to clean up corruption. Headlines screamed about organized vice, and citizens demanded action. Enter Thomas E. Dewey, the young, ambitious district attorney of New York. Dewey had made his name targeting bootleggers and mobsters, but now he had his sights set on the biggest fish of all, Lucky Luciano. Dewey was everything Luciano's world feared: incorruptible, disciplined, and obsessed with bringing down the mafia. He didn't just want arrests, he wanted headlines, victories that would propel his career into politics. And nothing would make a bigger story than the downfall of the man everyone whispered controlled New York. But getting to Luciano wasn't easy. Luciano never signed papers, never appeared at meetings and rarely spoke directly to anyone outside his trusted circle. His empire was insulated, layered in silence and loyalty. Dewey's challenge was to find a crack in that wall, and he found it in the one business Luciano had underestimated: prostitution. While Luciano had structured his gambling and labor rackets carefully, the brothel system, though lucrative, was messy. Too many people, too much talk, too many connections. The women working the streets, the madams running the houses, the pimps collecting money, they all operated under a loose chain that ultimately fed back into Luciano's coffers. Dewey's team began raiding brothels, interrogating madams, and connecting the dots. The name Lucky Luciano kept surfacing, not as a direct participant, but as the man behind the man behind the man. Meanwhile, Luciano's enemies within the underworld sensed his vulnerability. Genovese began whispering to associates that Luciano's time was ending, that he had become too visible, too complacent. Rivals like Joe Bonanno and others began hedging their bets, keeping one foot in Luciano's camp and another in Genovese's. The commission that Luciano had built as a tool of order was slowly turning into a political battlefield. Still, Luciano remained calm. He had survived worse. He believed that influence, not fear, kept men loyal, and so far it had worked. But the coming threat wasn't a rival with a gun, it was a prosecutor with evidence. When Dewey finally moved in 1936, it wasn't with gangland theatrics. It was with warrants, subpoenas, and witnesses. In a single night, dozens of brothels were raided across the city. Madams were dragged into custody, pimps were beaten into confession, and the paper trail began to form. Dewey's men claimed to have uncovered a vast prostitution ring with Luciano at its head. To the public, it was the scandal of the decade, the king of the underworld, accused of running a network of vice across New York. Luciano denied everything. He was a businessman, he said, not a pimp. But public opinion didn't care about nuance. Dewey's narrative was clean, dramatic, and moral, the righteous crusader against the dark prince of crime. The media ate it up. The storm had arrived. The empire that had taken years of blood and brilliance to build was now under siege from all sides, by a government that wanted his head and allies who secretly hoped he'd fall. Luciano didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of his fall, not by a bullet in the street, but by the cold efficiency of the courtroom. For years he had controlled violence, loyalty, and fear. But he was about to face something he couldn't control, the American justice system. And unlike the wars he'd survived before, this one would fight with ink and evidence instead of guns. In the spring of 1936, New York City woke up to headlines that shattered the illusion of the untouchable gangster. Lucky Luciano arrested, Vice King of New York, screamed the morning papers. For the first time in his life, Charles Lucky Luciano wasn't the one controlling the story. The man who had built an empire from the shadows was being dragged into the spotlight, accused not of murder or racketeering, but of something far more salacious, running the city's largest prostitution ring. Thomas E. Dewey, the young district attorney, had finally made his move. His team had spent months building the case, raiding brothels, interrogating madams, and connecting the cash flow to Luciano's lieutenants. More than 200 witnesses had been questioned, and 68 indictments were filed. It was an unprecedented operation, one that painted Luciano not as a businessman, but as the architect of moral decay in New York City. When Luciano was arrested in Hot Springs, Arkansas, he appeared calm, almost amused. Dressed immaculately, he told reporters, "I'm just a gambler. I don't know nothing about no women." But behind the calm exterior, he knew this was different. Dewey wasn't some crooked cop or political enemy. He was relentless, disciplined, and driven by ambition. Luciano had faced gangsters but never a prosecutor like this. The extradition process itself was a spectacle. Newspapers followed every move, reporters camped outside police stations, and photographers fought for a glimpse of the king of the underworld. When Luciano was finally brought back to New York, the crowd that gathered wasn't just there to see him fall, they came to see a myth undone. The trial began in May 1936, and from the very start, it was a theater of contrasts. On one side stood Dewey, clean-cut, confident, the embodiment of law and order. On the other sat Luciano, calm, well-dressed, and charismatic, the face of organized crime's new sophistication. The courtroom became a stage where morality and modernity clashed in full view of the public. Dewey's case was built not on direct evidence, but on testimony, the words of women, madams, and pimps who claimed to have worked for Luciano's organization. Many had been promised leniency for their cooperation. Their stories painted Luciano as the mastermind of a vast prostitution syndicate that spanned hundreds of brothels and made millions in profit. According to Dewey, Luciano took a cut from every dollar spent on the city's streets. Luciano's defense was simple. He denied everything. He claimed he barely knew the people involved, that his name was being used without his permission. His attorney argued that the prosecution's witnesses were unreliable, criminals trying to save themselves by inventing lies. But Dewey countered with precision, showing how money and orders traveled through layers of Luciano's men before reaching him. As the trial progressed, the tension grew. The public was enthralled. To many, Luciano wasn't just a man, he was the symbol of corruption, of how deeply organized crime had infiltrated American life. To others, he was still a folk hero, the poor immigrant who had outsmarted the system. The jury, however, wasn't swayed by romance or reputation. After 6 weeks, the verdict came. Guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. Luciano stood motionless as the sentence was read, 30 to 50 years in prison. The courtroom gasped. Dewey had done the impossible, he had taken down Lucky Luciano. The applause that followed was not just for justice, it was for the triumph of order over the underworld. For Luciano, the sentence was more than punishment, it was humiliation. He, who had controlled the very structure of organized crime, was now just another inmate in a cold cell. His empire was in shock. The commission, the very institution he'd created to prevent chaos, was thrown into confusion. Leadership shifted, alliances fractured, and whispers began about who would take control. Yet even behind bars, Luciano's mind never stopped working. He understood the mafia's golden rule: power doesn't disappear, it adapts. He may have lost his freedom, but his influence was far from dead. The men he had mentored, Costello, Genovese, Lansky, still operated, still respected his word. Luciano might have been caged, but his voice still echoed through the corridors of power. Outside the prison walls, Dewey's victory propelled him to fame, cementing his image as the man who cleaned up New York. But the story wasn't over. The government might have won the battle, but Luciano's empire wasn't built to collapse. It was built to endure. As the bars clanged shut behind him, Luciano faced his own creation, the system he had built to be unbreakable. And now, trapped within it, he began the next phase of his life, ruling the underworld from within the walls meant to contain him. Prison was supposed to end Lucky Luciano. It was meant to strip him of his influence, his power, and his empire. But by the late 1930s, it became clear that prison had only changed where he ruled, not whether he ruled. Even behind concrete walls and steel bars, Luciano remained what he had always been, the man who understood control better than anyone else. He was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, known among inmates as Little Siberia for its freezing temperatures and isolation. The authorities believed distance and cold would break him. Instead, Luciano adapted. Within weeks, guards and inmates alike treated him with quiet respect. He never barked orders or threw his weight around, he didn't have to. Luciano's strength was subtle. It came from presence, from the way he carried himself. Even in prison clothes, he looked like a man in charge. Soon he began to rebuild his world. Cigarettes, favors, protection, the same commodities that ran the streets ran the prison. Luciano found ways to communicate with the outside through lawyers, relatives, and even sympathetic guards. Letters and coded messages traveled between Dannemora and New York, reaching trusted lieutenants like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky. From these exchanges, orders were given, deals approved, and disputes settled. The commission, though shaken, still listened when Luciano's name was invoked. Frank Costello, ever the diplomat, became Luciano's public face on the outside. He focused on keeping peace among the families and maintaining their business interests. Under Costello's management, the mafia began blending even more deeply into legitimate industries: construction, garment factories, and the waterfront. Costello ensured Luciano's empire didn't collapse, it simply evolved. Meanwhile, Vito Genovese, ever the opportunist, had fled to Italy, avoiding prosecution by aligning himself with Mussolini's fascist government. Even from across the ocean, Genovese dreamed of replacing Luciano as boss, but his exile left a temporary balance in New York's power structure. No single man could fill Luciano's shoes. Inside the prison, Luciano maintained a careful rhythm. He spent his mornings reading newspapers, tracking world events and the underworld alike. He followed Prohibition's repeal, the rise of Las Vegas gambling, and the early tremors of war in Europe. "The world is changing again," he told one fellow inmate, "and where there's change, there's money." He knew that war, like Prohibition, would open new doors for organized crime. He just didn't know how soon it would come knocking. In 1942, World War II was in full swing and the U.S. Navy faced a dangerous problem. German submarines were sinking Allied ships right off the American coast. In New York Harbor, sabotage and dockyard espionage became a national concern. The government needed help controlling the docks, and ironically, no one controlled the docks better than the mafia. Through intermediaries, the Office of Naval Intelligence reached out to Frank Costello, and indirectly to Luciano. What began as a tentative alliance turned into one of the most extraordinary arrangements in criminal history. From his prison cell, Luciano helped facilitate cooperation between the Navy and the underworld, ensuring security along the docks, eliminating spies and guaranteeing labor peace. The operation was code-named Operation Underworld. It was never officially acknowledged at the time, but it effectively turned Luciano from prisoner to wartime asset. In exchange for his cooperation, he was granted small privileges in prison: better food, more access, and eventually the quiet promise of future consideration for release. It was a paradox. The same government that had destroyed him now relied on him to protect the nation's most vital harbor. Luciano's influence had transcended legality. He had become indispensable. After the war, Dewey, now governor of New York, faced pressure from both political and intelligence circles to reward Luciano for his contribution. In 1946, after serving nearly a decade of his sentence, Luciano's punishment was commuted on one condition: deportation to Italy. As he prepared to leave America, the country he had shaped from its underbelly, Luciano reportedly said, "They can deport me from America, but they can't deport me from the minds of the men who run it." And he was right. Even from afar, his legend would continue to shape the mafia's evolution. His methods, his rules, his commission, they had outlived his presence. Behind bars, Luciano had done something remarkable. He had turned imprisonment into an illusion, a temporary exile rather than an end. He had remained relevant in a world that had tried to erase him, and in doing so he proved that true power wasn't about physical freedom, it was about influence. As the prison gates opened in 1946 and he stepped onto the ship bound for Italy, Luciano was no longer the king of New York. But he was still a king, one whose empire, though unseen, stretched far beyond the horizon. When Charles Lucky Luciano stepped off the ship in Naples in February 1946, he looked like a man returning home. But Italy was no longer home, and America had exiled him not just from its soil, but from the world he had built. The docks of New York, the nightclubs, the whispered meetings, all gone. What awaited him in Italy was a different kind of prison. Freedom without power, wealth without purpose, fame without a throne. Naples was a city scarred by war. Bombed-out buildings and desperate poverty surrounded him, and yet, even here, Luciano carried an aura of quiet dominance. He rented a suite at the Hotel Excelsior overlooking the Bay of Naples. The staff knew who he was, the locals whispered his name. To them, he wasn't a criminal, he was a legend, a man who had once ruled the invisible empire across the sea. But Luciano wasn't content with nostalgia. From the very beginning, he sought to rebuild his network, reconnecting with the men who still owed him loyalty. He reached out to Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello through intermediaries, testing the waters of his influence. Letters were sent, couriers dispatched, coded messages passed through embassies and ships. Slowly, the outlines of a new empire began to take shape, one that would bridge Europe and America. He soon found an opportunity in the growing post-war black market. American soldiers stationed in Italy were a ready source of ration goods, cigarettes, and even drugs, all commodities that could be turned into profit. Luciano saw this as the seed of something bigger, a transatlantic narcotics network that could funnel heroin from the east through Italy into the United States. Though he denied his involvement to the end, American intelligence believed Luciano was quietly orchestrating the early foundation of what became known as the French Connection, a vast heroin pipeline that would dominate organized crime for decades. But Luciano's exile was not without its shadows. Italian authorities kept him under constant surveillance. Every move he made, every phone call, every meeting drew suspicion. He was periodically arrested, questioned, and released, but the message was clear: Italy didn't want him either. The Americans pressured their allies to keep him contained, fearing he might reignite the criminal structures they had spent years dismantling. To outsiders, Luciano seemed to live a luxurious life. He had money, women, fine suits, and elegant dinners in Naples and Rome. Yet beneath the surface he was restless. He was a man out of time, a relic from an era when power was measured by respect and fear, not by surveillance and bureaucracy. The world had changed. The mafia had changed. The new generation, men like Carlo Gambino and Joseph Bonanno, ran things differently now, quieter and colder. Luciano's rules had built the foundation, but the new dons no longer needed the architect. In 1947 he attended a secret meeting in Havana, the now famous Havana Conference, where America's top mobsters gathered to discuss business and the future of organized crime. Luciano's arrival there was an act of defiance. He had managed to sneak out of Italy and into Cuba under false papers. For a few months he was back among his peers, the old guard of power. Lansky, Costello, Siegel, Trafficante. It was a reunion of crime's royalty, and for a brief time, Luciano was king again. But the U.S. government soon learned of his presence. Pressure from Washington forced the Cuban authorities to deport him back to Italy. It was his last taste of America's shadow. From that moment on, he knew the door was closed forever. In his later years, Luciano became reflective. Friends described him as calm, philosophical even. He spent time walking along the coast, staring out at the sea that separated him from everything he had ever built. He read about his own myth in newspapers and crime books, the founding father of the American Mafia. He knew that, in a way, he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. The organization he had created was now bigger, richer, and more sophisticated than ever. But it no longer belonged to him. By the 1960s, Luciano was an aging legend, respected, feared, but isolated. He still received visitors from America, old associates and curious admirers, but most of his conversations turned nostalgic. He talked about the old days, about Lansky's precision, Costello's diplomacy, Siegel's temper. Those were men, he would say. We had rules. On January 26, 1962, Lucky Luciano collapsed and died of a heart attack at Naples International Airport, moments after meeting with a film producer who wanted to make a movie about his life. The irony was cruel and perfect. He died while preparing to immortalize himself. In exile, Luciano had become both ghost and godfather. A man whose physical empire was gone but whose influence had seeped into the bloodstream of modern organized crime. His exile was meant to erase him, but it did the opposite. It made him immortal, a symbol of power that could be exiled but never forgotten. When Lucky Luciano's heart stopped beating in that Naples airport in 1962, an era quietly ended, but a legend began to breathe on its own. His body was buried on American soil, but his ideas, his methods, his system lived on across continents. For many, Luciano's death was not the end of a man, it was the beginning of a myth. In the decades that followed, journalists, law enforcement, and historians all tried to define him. Was he a criminal genius or a pragmatic reformer of chaos? A ruthless killer or a visionary strategist? The truth was far more complex. Luciano embodied all of it, the coldness of a gangster and the logic of a statesman. He had turned something primitive and violent into something organized, efficient, and enduring. Before Luciano, the mafia in America was a tribal battlefield. Sicilian and Neapolitan gangs fought Irish and Jewish mobs in endless blood feuds, their empires collapsing as quickly as they rose. Luciano changed that by seeing what no one else had seen, that crime like business could be systematized. He eliminated the old-world parochialism that had kept the mafia fragmented and replaced it with a corporate model of power. The commission he built wasn't just a council of bosses, it was the prototype for modern criminal governance. He introduced something revolutionary: checks and balances in crime. No longer would a single don decide life and death for every man in New York. Instead, major decisions would require consensus, a vote among equals. It was a kind of twisted democracy, but it worked. The commission reduced internal wars, stabilized profits, and allowed the mafia to infiltrate legitimate industries. Luciano's fingerprints extended far beyond the five families. His vision reshaped organized crime in Chicago, Las Vegas, Havana, and even Europe. He taught gangsters to think like entrepreneurs, to diversify, to launder, to invest. The underworld he built was no longer content with controlling the streets. It began to control unions, banks, and politicians. Even law enforcement unknowingly adopted his logic. The FBI's later focus on organized crime families, their hierarchical charts, their understanding of criminal corporate structure, all stemmed from Luciano's blueprint. He had created a system so efficient that even his enemies had to study it to understand it. Psychologically, Luciano's legacy was deeper still. He represented the dangerous idea that power and morality could be separated, that order, even when built on crime, could justify brutality. In his own mind, Luciano wasn't a villain. He believed he had brought peace, stability, and prosperity to an otherwise chaotic world. "I only did what the politicians do," he once said. "I just did it better." That mindset, pragmatic, cold, and self-rationalizing, would echo through generations of criminals and corporate magnates alike. He turned the gangster into a businessman and, in doing so, blurred the line between crime and capitalism. In America's cultural imagination, Luciano became the archetype of the modern Don. Marlon Brando's portrayal of Vito Corleone in The Godfather, though based on several real figures, carried Luciano's calm authority, his belief in loyalty, balance, and reason over rage. His influence seeped into every fictional gangster that followed. Michael Corleone's cerebral control, Tony Soprano's internal conflicts, even the charismatic ruthlessness of characters like Nucky Thompson in Boardwalk Empire. All of them were, in some way, echoes of Lucky Luciano. But perhaps his most lasting impact was philosophical. Luciano's empire was built not just on violence, but on understanding human nature. He understood loyalty was never unconditional, it had to be managed, rewarded, and occasionally tested. He knew fear was a currency, but too much of it would bankrupt trust. And he recognized that power, to endure, had to be invisible. When they stop talking about you, he once said, that's when you're finished. Ironically, people never stopped talking about him. After his death, new generations of mafia leaders tried to follow his model. Some succeeding, others failing under the weight of their own greed. Carlo Gambino ruled quietly and efficiently, mirroring Luciano's preference for calm control. Others, like John Gotti, reveled in publicity and flamboyance, betraying the very principles Luciano had lived by. Never let them see you, Luciano had preached. Never make it personal. Gotti's downfall was, in many ways, proof that Luciano's philosophy had been right all along. By the 1970s, the mafia had reached unprecedented levels of influence, controlling unions, infiltrating Wall Street, and expanding into narcotics. The commission system that Luciano had built still governed its decisions. Even when the FBI's RICO Act began dismantling the mafia in the 1980s, they were dismantling his creation. Every indictment, every chart of mob hierarchy, every wiretap, all traced back to the architecture Luciano had designed. And yet, for all his brilliance, Luciano's story was also a tragedy. His exile had stripped him of the one thing he valued most: recognition. He had built an empire only to watch others inherit it. His name was whispered with reverence in the underworld, but never celebrated publicly. To the government he remained a criminal, to history a paradox. In his later years he often reflected on what it had all meant. According to friends, Luciano once said, "Power is like a knife. It can carve a future or slit a throat, depends who's holding it." He had held it masterfully, but it had also cut him. Even today his name carries a certain chill, not because of the crimes he committed but because of what he represented, the fusion of intelligence and ruthlessness. He wasn't just feared, he was respected. And that combination is what makes his story endure. His death didn't end his influence, it only made it quieter. The mafia continued to operate under his principles for decades after he was gone, and even now, elements of his philosophy live on in global organized crime. The idea of the commission inspired cartels, syndicates, and even legitimate corporations that studied the structure of distributed power. Beyond crime, Luciano's story holds a mirror to human ambition. It shows how brilliance and corruption can coexist, how a man can build order from chaos, and yet remain haunted by the very system he created. He built something enduring, but it was built on shadows. In the end, Lucky Luciano's true legacy wasn't money or violence. It was control. Control over men, systems, and narratives. Control that outlasted his body, his exile, even his name. And that is why, more than half a century later, his name still commands both fear and respect, whispered in the same breath as if the world still isn't sure whether to damn him or admire him. History remembers men like Lucky Luciano in shades of gray, the kind of gray that hides both brilliance and brutality, genius and sin. His story at its core is not just about crime or empire. It's about the human hunger for control, to shape chaos into order, to build something that lasts even when everything else crumbles. Luciano's name still commands fear and respect because he embodied a paradox that society both condemns and secretly admires: the outlaw who becomes a king, the criminal who builds civilization's mirror image. When we look back at Luciano's life, we are not just tracing the history of organized crime, we are examining the birth of modern power itself. He lived in an America divided between law and corruption, between poverty and excess. He was the product of that tension, an immigrant boy who discovered that in a world stacked against him, power was the only language anyone respected. That understanding shaped everything he became. It was there in his eyes as a 10-year-old on the Lower East Side, watching his father come home from long days of backbreaking labor. It was there in his voice when he told his friends, "I ain't gonna work for nobody." To him, survival wasn't about goodness, it was about control. In a society that denied him legitimacy, he built his own version of it. And so began the legend of Lucky Luciano, the man who turned crime into an institution. But to understand why his name still carries such weight, we have to strip away the mythology and confront the man underneath. Luciano's genius wasn't in cruelty or charisma, it was in vision. He looked at the bloody, chaotic underworld of early 20th century America and saw what no one else did. That power without structure dies and greed without restraint consumes itself. He saw the mafia not as a collection of gangs, but as an organism, something that could grow, adapt, and survive. In the wake of Prohibition, when other mobsters were killing each other for scraps, Luciano was designing a system that could endure beyond one man, one family, or one generation. That system, the Commission, still exists in some form today nearly a century later. And that's why his story endures. Because it's not just a crime story, it's a blueprint. Think about it. Every corporation, every political machine, every clandestine power structure in the modern world operates on principles Luciano pioneered. Chain of command, compartmentalization, loyalty, profit sharing, dispute resolution through negotiation rather than open conflict. Luciano didn't invent these ideas, he perfected them for a world that lived outside the law. In doing so, he blurred the line between legitimate power and organized crime. His commission meetings resembled corporate board sessions more than gang summits. His men wore suits, not street clothes. He banned unnecessary killings, demanded discipline, and turned crime from an emotional act into a rational enterprise. It was control by design, and it worked. But what makes Luciano truly fascinating, and dangerous, is how human his reasoning was. He didn't see himself as evil. He saw himself as necessary. In his mind, the world had rules, but they were written by the powerful to keep others powerless. All he did was write his own set of rules. And that justification, that quiet rationalization, is what makes him timeless. Because every age produces its own Lucianos. Not all of them carry guns or run gambling rings. Some wear tailored suits in corporate towers. Some sit in government offices. Some lead nations. The names change, but the pattern doesn't. The hunger for control, the ability to organize chaos, the willingness to do what others won't. Luciano's story then becomes more than the tale of a gangster. It's a parable about how societies create their own villains, and how those villains in turn reflect the society that made them. America in the early 20th century worshipped success, power, and ambition. Luciano simply achieved those things by the fastest route available to him. When we look at his legacy, we see that same contradiction reflected in our collective fascination. We hate what he represented, corruption, exploitation, manipulation, but we admire the mastery with which he wielded it. We quote his words, we adapt his methods, and we mythologize his ruthlessness into charm. In that sense, Lucky Luciano became less a man than an idea, the embodiment of power unchained from morality. Even his enemies respected him. Prosecutors, journalists, and rival mobsters all spoke of him with a peculiar reverence. Thomas Dewey, the man who sent him to prison, later admitted that Luciano's intelligence would have made him a great industrialist had he chosen a different path. That's the tragedy of Luciano's life, that his brilliance found its outlet in crime only because society offered him no other door. But perhaps Luciano's greatest irony is that his ultimate downfall came not from law enforcement, but from his own success. The very structure he built to keep the mafia alive eventually made it impersonal. Power dispersed. Loyalty became transactional. The mafia of the 1950s and 60s, rich, bureaucratic, and global, was no longer the brotherhood Luciano envisioned. It had become what he always feared, an empire without honor. And yet, even then, his fingerprints remained everywhere. When the FBI broke the mafia's code in the 1960s and 70s through wiretaps and the RICO Act, they weren't dismantling a criminal network. They were dismantling Luciano's idea, the belief that power could be permanent if you built it like a system. His story has continued to echo through culture because it taps into something deeply human, the allure of control. People are drawn to Luciano not because he was a killer or a criminal, but because he mastered the game. He made himself untouchable, and for a time he succeeded. That illusion of control, that seductive promise that one can rise above the rules, it's the heartbeat of every ambition from Wall Street to Washington. In death, Luciano achieved what he could never quite grasp in life: immortality. His body was buried in Naples, far from the streets that made him, but his name never left New York. The mafia he built became a global template, copied by cartels in Mexico, syndicates in Russia, and triads in Asia. His philosophy, to organize, to profit, to endure, became the universal language of power. But immortality, like empire, comes with a price. As much as Luciano's name commands respect, it also commands fear, not for what he did but for what he revealed. His life stripped bare the comforting illusion that power and morality go hand in hand. He showed that one could exist without the other, that structure can replace virtue and efficiency can replace ethics. In Luciano's world there was no right or wrong, only advantage and loss. That's why his story still feels contemporary. Because in every age, in every system, that same logic persists. We see it in corporations that exploit without conscience, in governments that lie for stability, in individuals who justify cruelty as pragmatism. Luciano's ghost lingers not in the streets of Little Italy, but in boardrooms, algorithms, and decisions made behind closed doors. He remains the unspoken reminder that power, once created, never disappears. It simply changes form. And yet, amid all the darkness, there is something strangely instructive in his legacy. Luciano's discipline, his focus, his refusal to act out of passion. Those same qualities directed differently could have made him one of the great builders of the modern world. He proved that intellect, organization, and strategic thinking could move mountains, even if he chose to move them in the shadows. His life stands as both a warning and a lesson, that greatness without conscience is a tragedy waiting to happen. If there's one image that defines Lucky Luciano, it isn't of him giving orders in a smoky backroom or posing in a fedora. It's of him in exile, standing alone by the sea in Naples, looking out at a horizon he could never cross again. Behind him lay the ghosts of his empire, before him, an ocean that separated him from everything he had ever built. And yet even there he looked like a man in control. That image, the powerful man made powerless, yet still dignified, captures why his story endures. Luciano was not invincible. He was simply human in the most amplified sense. He embodied both the dream and the corruption at the heart of ambition. His life reminds us that every empire, criminal or legitimate, is built on the same fragile foundation, the human desire to be remembered, to matter, to bend fate to one's will. Luciano succeeded where few ever do. He didn't just build an empire, he built a myth. Today his name still opens doors and whispers. His rules are still quoted in criminal circles. His legacy still influences power structures across the globe. And every time someone says, "It's just business, nothing personal," they're echoing the cold logic that Lucky Luciano perfected. He was, in every sense, the father of organized crime. But more than that, he was a mirror, reflecting our own complicated relationship with power. We condemn men like him because they remind us how easily our virtues can bend under the weight of ambition. We fear him because we recognize a part of ourselves in him, that quiet voice that whispers, "If the rules are unfair, why follow them at all?" Lucky Luciano's story doesn't end with his death, because it was never just his story. It's the story of every society that rewards power over principle, every system that confuses order with justice, every individual who believes they can master the world without losing their soul. And that is why, even now, decades after his heart stopped beating in a foreign airport, the name Lucky Luciano still commands both fear and respect. Not because of the crimes he committed, but because of the truth he embodied. That power, once understood, is the most dangerous addiction of all.